Hello, and welcome to Edge and Digital Transformation via SLE Micro and Rancher. Here's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Brian Frome. I'm a Technical Alliance Manager here at SUSE, and I'd like to have Brian Gartner introduce himself.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, the other Brian with the Y. I'm on the Alliance team as well. I'm the Senior Technology Strategist, and I work with hardware partners, software partners, and embedded partners. So take it away, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. So we're going to dive into digital transformation and how that applies to edge solutions. So edge applications are really driving part of digital transformation at companies. If you look at the marketplace, these are just some examples of market areas where edge is really taking off. There are just a number of other typical markets that we can talk about, and you'll see in other slides, that are also gaining traction with companies that are moving digital transformation technology and applications to the edge. And what that's doing is really driving the need for change in terms of technology. And of course, some of that comes from the ability to bring better compute power to devices, better networking and reduce latency. Of course, a renewed attention to security at all levels. And then really, there's a whole new area that's coming together in the past few years that we refer to as application infrastructure. And that's really managing the applications that run in the IoT Internet of Things or at the devices. And there's just a huge scale here of need to manage these devices across an enterprise landscape. So let's talk a little bit about edge and digital transformation, as those two concepts really go together really well. Companies are really looking to get closer to their customers, and they want to do that through digital services. And that really brings customers closer to their business by engaging in technology in a number of different ways. That could be a device that the customer is interacting with to interact with the company. It could be bringing data to a manufacturing floor in new ways or pulling data from these different environments. So it's really a need of enterprises to innovate, to compete, because if you look at digital transformation, many companies are beginning to latch on to these ideas and begin to innovate with their technology and their service availability for their customers at the edge in particular. And so enterprises really need to innovate to compete by bringing new services to bear. And that's a real opportunity as well. These companies can not only innovate and engage their customers in new ways, that leads to new business opportunities, new revenue opportunities. And then finally, there's just a plethora of data that's being generated at the edge through all sorts of new devices and compute technologies. And so companies have access to this technology and this data, but need to figure out what to do with it. So they really need new analytics and new machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to really understand what's available in that data at the edge and turn that into something sensible that their customers can utilize. So a big piece of this transformation for enterprises is modernizing and standardizing. If you think about the data center, there's some legacy hardware and componentry in the data center today that made sense 10 to 5 years ago. But really, to drive the speed that companies need to drive innovation at the edge, they need to bring modernized technology to bear. And that not only needs to be modernized, it can't be one-off kind of technology. It can't be hardware and software that's hard to manage or takes specialized knowledge. It really needs to be kind of like what cloud providers are doing, standardized componentry that's easy to manage, to deal with, to deploy quickly, to tear down when they need to fix if it breaks. And standardization is a big piece of that. So there's this balance between modernization and what technologies go there and standardization. And you'll see that as we talk more about the technologies that we build in terms of the infrastructure that lead to edge application development. So let's talk about some other edge development considerations. Here are a number of use cases in markets that are common for companies in these markets to begin looking at the application infrastructure, the Kubernetes application infrastructure that they need to build up these new edge applications. And you can see this is just even still a small set of the markets that we engage with and our partners engage with. But manufacturing and Industry 4.0, financial services, automotive and transportation, public sector and government, healthcare, uh, life science as a component of healthcare, retail. Those are just some of the markets where edge is becoming really a key technology that plays to engage customers in new ways. And again, we talked a little bit about the need for scale. By bringing technologies to bear into these marketplaces, we're really just dramatically expanding the footprint of computing that happens in these market locations where customers are. Let's just talk about a quick example. Retail is a great example. I like to use the idea of a Walmart store or a Walgreens store. Just in North America alone, there's thousands of these stores, and each of these stores might have hundreds of devices. Those are cameras and point of sales devices and sensors and scanners, all sorts of componentry that all has their own infrastructure in them. And so we want to manage that infrastructure in a uniform way. We want to make sure that it's not one-off technology that's hard to manage, that's hard to make secure. And the management then, if you think of hundreds of devices times thousands of stores, we're talking tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of devices that need to be managed in new ways. And so the technology choices we make there are very important, and they need to be, again, like a cloud provider. We need things that are quick, easy to deploy to, easy to automate, easy to manage, and easy to monitor, diagnose, and work with. And so we need tools that operate at that scale. Here on this slide is a graphic of that kind of high-level view of the stack that we look at when we're building up the application infrastructure at the edge. And you can imagine there's certainly hardware, although sometimes that hardware might be managed by someone else, a managed service provider or a cloud service provider. But that hardware might be hardware in our company's data center, right, in our IT data center, although some of that hardware will get out at various locations, in regional locations closer to, let's say, stores if we're talking retail, or even in the store itself. There might be closets that have mini data centers in them, very small footprint machines, just enough to manage the plethora of data that's being generated by the hundreds of devices. Then there's software products, from operating systems to Kubernetes infrastructure. I call that the application infrastructure layer. That's the stuff that we need our applications to run on. And we'll talk about SUSE products here and why that makes for a nice, uniform, modernized, standardized environment. Then we need to automate and build up that environment in consistent ways so that we know we can get infrastructure that's secure and easy to deploy and easy to tear back down. And so we leverage various types of automation, from infrastructure as code that defines the infrastructure and the policy and governance that goes with it, to dedicated, or specialized, I should say, automation for our applications and workloads themselves. And then finally, these are all new methodologies and new technologies that we're employing. So we as a development group might understand our edge application well, but we need to be able to train other components or other people in our company, as well as the partners and service providers. So we all need services and training to understand the plethora of technology in the stack that we're looking at building. Another key characteristic is security. So we need security to be an end-to-end process. And you'll see that used to be sort of an internal IT operations technique, but now it goes all the way from development of application through the use of the application at the edge. And that's really changing the landscape of the types of challenges that are being presented for security. So again, we need an end-to-end architecture of security, from hardware up into the infrastructure layers, the software infrastructure, all the way up to our workloads. And we talked about modernizing and standardizing. So when we get to technology and we begin to see how this technology layers, you'll see how standardization is so important, that we want components that we can trust, that are well tested by our vendors. Again, we don't want to be pulling one-off component technology that may be good, but or may have problems. And a single environment is really desirable. It's not always achievable, but a single operating system, a single operating environment, certainly at the Kubernetes layer, Kubernetes is a standard that allows us to have one view of the platform or application infrastructure layer that we land our applications on. And that simplifies the challenge that we have for management, for training. So you can see how modernization and standardization really go together in terms of these aspects of building up our application infrastructure. And we talked a bit about Kubernetes. We'll get into a lot more detail as to how Kubernetes applies here in across the landscape, the IT landscape. We've certainly got various forms of Kubernetes. We've got Kubernetes in the data center. That might come from one provider. Then we've got Kubernetes at the edge on these small devices. That may come from another provider. We've got Kubernetes in the managed service provider or cloud provider. That may come from yet a third provider. So we need to manage all of those Kubernetes instances, and they need to be uniform. They need to be standardized, and we need to be able to manage them in a single kind of pane of glass, as well as a single way of thinking of solving the problems in terms of their management. So let's dive into the technologies that implement all of these things that we've just talked about. And to do that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Brian Gardner.
Explaining why we need to do this and what we need to consider. So now we'll kind of go into that next level of how can we do that, right? So you've done the why and the what. Now we'll talk about how you can do some of this stuff. So let's go to the next slide. So just like Brian mentioned, it really is transformation. It's a digital transformation, but it's transformation to the edge. It's becoming a distributed computing environment, okay? And that edge infrastructure, just like he talked about in the stores, it could be thousands of these things all over the place, right? And you want to have a consistent application infrastructure. So things like cloud native with Kubernetes and whatnot. And you can see how that scaling of not only the resources that you're running on, you need that speed and agility to make that happen across all of this space. So that transformation becomes very much more like an agile thing. I need to do like a CI/CD thing. I need to be able to develop the application, test it, get it all running, get it wherever to go, and then realize, oops, we forgot to take into account of this, and iterate through that really quickly and deploy it across lots of nodes again. So you really want to automate that development process. And some of the pieces that you can do this with are things like SUSE SLE Micro, okay? And it is very focused on being an edge-tailored operating system. And we'll cover some more of that later. And then we talked about Kubernetes, but we actually have with the SUSE Rancher product family, a product called K3S, which is very focused on being an edge-tailored Kubernetes, very lightweight, very easy to install, but completely functional so that you can do all those workloads whenever you need to. And then, of course, from a scaling aspect, you need something like SUSE Rancher, which is multi-cluster management. And even though I'm saying multi-cluster, it could be lots of individual nodes that are running Kubernetes. Okay, just to make you clear on that. But now with that SUSE Rancher, just like Brian talked about it a minute ago, I have those edge devices that need this, but I also have stuff in the data center where I might need to do the machine learning models or data that's accumulated in the cloud and doing even AI or ML there as well. And there is another tool within the Rancher space called Fleet, which helps you address some of those things I talked about on the bottom via GitOps and being able to do the CI/CD and being able to deploy those things wherever you need, whenever you need it. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit more overview of SLE Micro, again, it is a smaller footprint. And just think of it in terms of the SUSE Linux Enterprise Server. It's smaller than that by default, but it has all the core functionality you need probably to get started with. And it does have a functionality aspect that you really should do everything in a specific workload place. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But it really is usable on small edge devices. I mean, I could run this on a Raspberry Pi if I needed to. Okay, if that's all I needed there, I can run it there. But what it also does is it inherits a lot of the other functionality from the more general purpose operating system to be able to be mission critical, because SLE Micro is immutable. Think of it in terms of it's a read-only, read-mostly file system. So it's a lot more secure and it's harder to mess with without knowing how to do that. Okay. So security aspect is taken into that account really. And again, because of that, it's low maintenance. So you can have a maintenance infrastructure with developers like SLE Micro because it's open source, it's modular. I mean, I can run it as a VM on my laptop and play with it and do everything I need to do. And I know that's what it's going to be like when the workload's running out there. But over on the right-hand side, it's kind of to close the loop and circle around again. This is really perfect for, and the focus is to run containers there, but you can run virtual machines if you need to, because we know that the digital transformation is not complete for anybody yet. So maybe that's what they were running before. You can run it on top of SLE Micro as well. But you can also do the more scalable approach of running Kubernetes there. And all of those containerized workloads and microservices can be handled via that as well. So next slide, please. Drilling in a little bit more with that immutability, I talked about its read-only root file system. It truly is that. There are some directories where things can be written, but in general, where the operating system sits, it's read-only, okay? And what happens is we have a thing called transactional update. So if you do need to fix something, change something, you can apply that fix and it goes into a snapshot next to what's running on that root read-only file system. And then you can reboot and take into account and use whatever you just added. But what's even more important about that is you can put in test cases and say, really, I want this service to be running. And I do that update, I do the reboot. And if the service doesn't run, that test case can be part of the boot process. And it goes, oh, something went wrong. I'll just roll back to the last known good state. You'll get to that space. Now, developer, can you fix that application, make it work? And then you can try it again, okay? And there are no limits in that snapshot and rollback. That's how you do updates at the OS level. Again, the workloads should be containerized, but you can run VMs, and there's actually a web interface called Cockpit that you can do this with as well. But you can also even put managed packaged kinds of software on there too. And we're even working with partners now to deploy other applications on the bare metal aspect of SLE Micro and having something like K3S or Kubernetes running beside it, so that this one has more privilege and things like that, and it's in that read-only root file system. That's very handy to do. Furthermore, what we've added within our portfolio is this SUSE Linux enterprise-based container images. So now if you want to deploy your workload on top of something like that, you can grab things from our registry, you can put your application on top of it, you can create a manifest to run it on Kubernetes or a Helm chart and have that deployed, okay? And what that provides you is not only just the OS image, but there's actually programming language images out there too. So if you're a big Python person, yep, you can do the Python one, start with that, put your Python application on, and that could be the base container image plus your application that runs here. Next slide. So like we mentioned, you probably want to have Kubernetes on the edge. And that, again, in the digital transformation, that's kind of the goal, is to get to this point. And what we have with our Rancher portfolio is called K3S. Again, it is very small, lightweight, but it is totally fully functional from a Kubernetes perspective. And it is very easy to install, literally a one-line command. And it can actually be deployed from something I'll talk about next too. It is production ready. It has all the APIs that you probably expect to use. It's perfect for running these workloads at the edge, especially on these appliance kinds of things. And again, on top of SLE Micro, that's read-only. And it's very reliable and scalable. Let's say that you have a couple node cluster that you want to do this on, like in a retail space or in a closet cluster in a hospital. You can have a cluster of K3S. So now you get the availability, the resiliency. So that now you can even maintain one node and all your workloads get slid over to the other couple of nodes. And then you can do things like that too. So it gives you that reliability and scalability. And there is no limit on the number of these things that you can run. It's more a limit of how many things do you have to run it on. Okay. It's not a limit saying, oh, you can only run this 100 times. No, because we know that you can run millions of these things and even manage the millions. But again, it is a single binary, very lightweight, and it's optimized for both x86 and for ARM. So let's go on to the next one. Oh, before you go on, Brian, one thing I forgot to mention was that Longhorn piece. Sorry about that. So a lot of times, when the 12-factor stuff came out with cloud native and whatnot, there was the notion that all containers are ephemeral and you don't need to have data. Well, just think about the whole point of the edge computing was to have data there, and you want to have that potentially there in case there's a container issue or something, or in case you want another container to do something. So that's what Longhorn is. It's a block storage thing that can run on an edge device, and that can be your persistent, your storage claim, your persistent volume claim, all that you need for that container. And you can actually do the whole data pipeline approach of cleansing the data came in, doing things with it, and then actually doing the analysis that you need to say, yep, I need to turn on the air conditioning because the temperature is too high. Okay. You can do that. And that's what Longhorn provides. Okay. So once you hit that scaling issue and you've gone beyond having a few that you can handle and manage, SUSE Rancher is part of our portfolio as well. And it does multi-cluster management by default. That is its value add. And again, if you had all those nodes and all those stores across the place, you can put SUSE Rancher as a dashboard to manage all of those, quote, clusters, which are all single nodes or 3-node clusters or whatever. And it treats all Kubernetes distributions as first-class citizens. So if you needed to run something else in your data center or in the core or in the cloud or wherever, you can also manage those, and that's where your workload could be generated. And then the workflow could be moved to that edge device later on. It really is about the value in Kubernetes management. If you need to change versions, no problem. We can do that, right? And you can roll those forward as well. And of course, just like with everything that comes with SUSE, it is open source, and that's a huge value add. And it always makes me smile when it's open source. Next up, Brian. And one thing I mentioned earlier, again, was the notion about how to deal with that continuous integration, continuous delivery, and whatnot. There is a tool in this space called Fleet, and it gives you the ability to essentially have a developer check things into Git. And as soon as that check-in happens, it can start that process for you. And it can move it to the dev environment, it can move it to the QA, the test environment. Or if it's already been passed and all that, it can go all to those labeled edge nodes that are out there, and boom, there you go, it's done. Okay. That's what Fleet gives you the ability to do is to manage not only Kubernetes, but those workloads across any of your infrastructure. And this is incredibly invaluable when you think about that scaled edge environment. Next slide. One other thing that you might want to consider, and this is very handy too, is SUSE Manager. And this gives you the ability to not only build, and that we have this going in like the retail space already for point of service kinds of devices. It can go ahead and build an image, and literally you can say, okay, when the store closes on Sunday evening, redeploy the new golden image. Okay. You could do the same thing in this space with the stack that we just talked about. And we have it already in place that you could put a new image on that edge device with the new things that you need running, with the K3s running, and already registering to the Rancher server so that you could do kind of a golden image approach. But you can also do the other thing too with SUSE Manager and just query all these things and go, oh, look, there is a security issue with something like this. We can just go update that one thing rather than just doing a golden image. So you can see how you can do patches, updates. You can do that in node management. And even in the SLE Micro space, it is supported now. And you can do that. And that transactional update, even though it's slightly different from the normal RPM kind of package updates, SUSE Manager knows how to do this. And I have this running even in my home lab. Next up. And one thing that I really wanted to highlight too, just to make sure, because Brian brought this point up and I was nodding, the whole notion of the security across this whole stack is very important. And you can see again that scalability and all those layers that win that stack, you need to make sure that you address each of those, not only from when you develop the application, but when it's deployed, when it's running, after you do an update and things like that. So each one of these layers has security things, and you can see in there in the SUSE Linux enterprise space, just like the SE Linux thing, that runs on SLE Micro. So you have those policies and everything. So you can say, I only want these things to be working. And if somebody else were to somehow get something on there, that would say, you're not running. You're not going to do anything. Okay. So, and in the K3S space, same thing as far as being able to do like FIPS compliance and stuff, because you realize that that thing is at the edge and there needs to be connectivity to somewhere else and translation and data pipeline movement. So making sure that that is secure and everything is viable. And then even in the SUSE Rancher space, of course, there's those couple of things that you can add there as well. NewVector is basically to look at your workloads and monitor all that security in a zero trust mindset. But you can even have policies and whatnot to make sure that only what should be deployed gets deployed wherever it needs to be deployed. Okay. So I'm just highlighting a little bit of that space, but just showing you the portfolio is good. Next up. And with that, I'll quickly go over a summary. So like Brian mentioned up front, this is very much an opportunity for business growth because again, once you realize I need to get more information about my supply chain, the trucks that are delivering something, that thing in the healthcare space, is that X-ray device working right? You need to do this to do a more effective business, and you realize that analytics at the edge really helps you do that and helps you scale even beyond the people resources you have, but it augments what it is. And that's really valuable across all those verticals, plus even more, like Brian mentioned, that were on that one slide. Next up. And this is just a picture of the portfolio again, but you see it down on the bottom, right? Edge. You see in that middle green space, SLE Micro. You see in the upper space, the K3S and the SUSE Rancher. You can see how all those pieces came from the portfolio, and you can expand beyond that, even including like the Longhorn piece for that storage if you needed it on that edge device. Next slide. And there are a few resources here, some links and whatnot, just for you to help you and whatnot. So if you're talking about the cloud native stuff and things like that Brian talked about, there's some resources there. But if you just want to look at the edge space, there you go. And if you just need to look at the OS space, you can look there. All these resources are valuable for you and just references so that you can go find stuff quickly after you've heard this presentation. Next up. And with that, and the dogs thanked us too. So I would definitely like to say thank you for joining, and also thank you to Brian because he does a great job presenting and doing these kinds of slides. Brian, if you want to add anything.
And just thank you, and thank you from my dog. So yeah, I thank you as an audience for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your SUSECon.